Okay, you guys, video 2, we're going to introduce the EU. So, the EU, in a broad sense, well, first off, it evolved and became increasingly integrated over time. In the 1950s, it was a much smaller block of nations. It was called the European Economic Community. And you can see that those nations are the ones that are colored in this, I guess, orange. I don't know, that's orange. So, what is that? Like red, reddish, sure. So that one was just a trading bloc. It was just economically integrated. And then we see over time the EU becomes increasingly integrated, right? Its interests now include reducing regional inequalities. It also has common environmental policies, human rights laws, and it also invests in more of a collective pool towards education and research. So, again, just consider the ways in which the EU's roles have expanded from just a simple economic union in the 1950s to one that has become increasingly politically intertwined. And we could also think about how that uh, might make certain nations more inclined to want to leave, right? In the case of Brexit, with increasing political integration, this makes the United Kingdom feel like it has less national sovereignty, and that causes it to push away. So, how does the EU's budget work? Um, so nations contribute based on a proportion of their GDP, and as you can see, this means that the most economically powerful nations contribute the biggest chunk to the overall EU's budget, and it also receives rebates. So each country receives money back from the EU in order to support their development and other projects. And it's important for us to realize that the UK also gets a rebate or money back on its contribution because a lot of its budget is spent on agricultural subsidies. These subsidies help the British farm industry remain competitive with the rest of Europe. And British farming actually only produces about half of what they consume, so they rely heavily on imports from other EU countries. So we could consider that. We could think about the extent to which Britain gets back what they put in. Right. So after all repayments are taken into account, Britain contributes about 12.6% of the entire EU's budget. Germany pays the largest share, which is 21.36%, and then France contributes the second biggest amount at 15.72. So Britain actually, arguably because it is actually just behind Germany in terms of GDP, and then France is behind the UK. You can see that just based on the figures, the UK does get a considerable amount back based on what it puts in. And so that is a question that maybe should be on the minds of more Brexiters. To what extent are they going to have to actually contribute more than they put back if they leave the EU? How the EU allocates its budget. This is also a question on the mind of a lot of Brexiters, as you can see, because the biggest chunk of the EU's budget goes into supporting poorer regions. And as regions with less stable economies join the EU, this means that the more powerful nations and the bigger contributors like Germany, France, and the UK are increasingly contributing to aid these nations. And so that might be a greater contributor to Euroscepticism. I just really want to plug that you guys watch this. So this is one of the reasons why I actually put the embedded videos even on the review slides. This really digs into the complexity of the EU, so I strongly encourage you guys to take a minute after you finish this video to rewatch this. And so you can find that if you go to the slides on number 16. Just go to the review slides. So this slide really gives you a sense of the messiness of the EU and the ways in which there's a video that actually shows up in the next slide that tells you about all the asterisks that are associated with the EU. So it's important for us to realize that not all EU regions have adopted the euro, and the euro nations, or the nations that have adopted the euro rather, belong to the eurozone, so you can check those out here. All these nations in the blue belong to the EU. You also have the European Economic Area that allows tariff-free trading, but you can see that there are nations that belong to the EEA that do not belong to the EU. And then lastly, you also have the Schengen Area, which is an area that comprises 26 of the European states that have officially abolished passports and all other types of border control at their mutual borders. So, ironically, there are certain regions in the EU that do not belong to the Schengen area, and then there are nations that are not in the EU that do, right? So, the UK still allows people to live there who are EU citizens, but you cannot just freely cross the border. So the Schengen area is a little bit different than the EEA. All right, just another plug. This is the video that gets into all the asterisks, hence the title, right? So definitely check that out because it gives you more of a sense of the complexity of the EU. And then lastly, when you're reviewing, take a second and make sure you can answer all these questions. So it's sort of pointless for me to just read them to you. So just take a second, pause this, and when you're studying, go over all these questions. A lot of them are actually covered in this past slide, right? So you did this in class, but again, review this. And then we'll kick off with the next video, which is going to get into some more of the nuances. Actually, I'll start reviewing some of these questions, like how is it similar to NAFTA in the US in the next video. So stay tuned for that one, and thanks.